Morning. The best thing I ever did was nothing. Yes, that's right. Your worst fears have come true. You're going to spend the next 15 minutes listening to someone talk about nothing. Well, that's not quite true. So let's start where I like to start. Fresh, clean, and ready for action in the shower. Did you take a shower this morning? Did you take a shower yesterday? I certainly hope so. Have you ever had a thought or idea in the shower that you thought was unique? Something that wouldn't normally come to your mind? The Collins English Dictionary defines a shower thought as a sudden idea that occurs to a person during an unconnected, mundane activity. Driving, waiting in line, showering, all of them boring, and yet all seem to spawn the most unique ideas. Why would we get our most interesting ideas at the least interesting times? Why did Archimedes have his eureka moment in the bath? Isaac Newton under the apple tree? Albert Einstein said himself that he had some of his greatest ideas while working a boring and mindless job at a patent office. But before we dive into the special powers of shower thoughts, I want to go on another tangent, this time into the grey matter. The human brain has a lot of neurons, 86 billion actually. And out of that 86 billion, around 500,000 are able to do something amazing. They are able to produce a chemical called dopamine. Dopamine is one of the 4 main reward system chemicals in the brain, and according to Google Trends, in just the past 5 years, relative search interest for dopamine has more than doubled. We're twice as interested now as we were just 5 years ago, but do we really understand how it works? Dopamine is often referred to as the feel-good drug or the feel-good chemical, which is kind of accurate, but I think we can do better. I like to refer to dopamine as the motivation chemical. Admittedly much less catchy, but probably more accurate. Let me explain. Scientists are able to genetically modify mice in order to remove genes involved with the synthesis of dopamine. Essentially, they're able to create dopamine-deficient mice. And when they observe these mice, something unusual happens. They don't eat. Even with food just inches from them, they reject it and ultimately starve. When the food is placed in their mouths, however, they're quick to chew it up and swallow. It seems like when dopamine is out of the equation, it's not the food that the mice are rejecting, but rather the effort needed in order to obtain it. Simply put, if the reward is difficult to obtain, they won't bother, but if it's served up, they'll gladly accept it. It seems that 2 things can be true at the same time. I'm not saying that dopamine isn't a feel-good chemical, but more significantly, the primary role of dopamine may be to motivate us to take action. Think of it this way. Imagine your brain has a scale inside of it. Your brain uses this scale to determine if certain actions are worth taking. On one side of the scale lies the perceived benefit. What can you gain from taking the action? On the other side, the perceived cost. What would the action cost in terms of time, effort, risk, energy, etc.? If your brain perceives the costs as being greater than the benefits, then that's the way the scale will tip, and whatever action it was that you were considering, you likely won't take. And it works the other way around too. If the perceived benefits are greater, you likely will take the action. This is why, for so many of us, it's so easy to skip a workout or ignore a concerningly large pile of dirty dishes in the sink, and generally say, yeah, I'll do it tomorrow, even in situations where we know facing the challenge will benefit us massively. The brain unfortunately favors benefits that are more immediate, and although the benefits of a certain action might be large, they might be too far away and the cost of the action might be too great. Exercising is hard, learning a new skill is hard, and unfortunately just about all things that help us grow as people have a tendency to be not easy. The good news is, this scale in our minds seems to be ever changing. As it turns out, our perception of cost and benefit is affected by dopamine. One study out of Brown University found that subjects having higher dopamine synthesis capacity in the caudate nucleus, essentially having more dopamine, was associated with a greater willingness to allocate cognitive effort. In other words, they were more willing to do stuff, challenging stuff. When we have more dopamine, our brains give the benefit side of the scale a boost, adding some weight to it, meaning we're more likely to take actions even if they're challenging or uncomfortable. Lower levels of dopamine lead us to perceive the cost as being greater, making us shy away from challenge and struggle. Wherever our dopamine goes, our motivation follows. When our dopamine is low, this is when we order that pizza that's a little too big, watch Netflix for a little too long, and regret it all immediately after. When our dopamine is high, this is when we clean our whole house and actually enjoy it. Now I know what you're thinking. All right, get to the point. What did you actually do? At least that's what I think whenever I watch a Greenstone. So I'll do just that. It was when I started to find out more about dopamine and the reward system that I decided that if I truly wanted to understand dopamine, I had to turn myself into the lab rat. Professor Drew Dawson from the University of Central Queensland is internationally recognized for his contributions to the scientific community and to industry in the areas of sleep fatigue research and human behavior. With his guidance, I started to plan out my experiment. I first determined what I thought were the most significant sources of quick and easy rewards in my life. I called them my dopamine cheat codes. Here's the list: ultra-processed foods, video games, television, movies, social media, including video sharing platforms like YouTube, and finally, podcasts. Now, like any good experiment, I had to have a baseline condition, something that I could use for comparison, a control. In this case, the baseline condition was essentially just my normal life, making full use of all my dopamine cheat codes. So I decided that a 1-week period would be enough. For that week, I journaled based on a list of criteria, including things like sleep, quality, mood, productivity, well-being, and much more. When that was finished, I entered the experimental condition. This was the period in which I was not allowed to use any of the things on the aforementioned list for a total of 92 days, or 3 months. A quarter year with no dopamine cheat codes. I journaled every day during this period, using the same criteria as the control, and within just the first few days, something amazing happened. I got bored. So bored. It didn't take me long to realize just how much all my dopamine cheat codes had prevented me from experiencing boredom. Now, there was no escaping it. No inbox to check, no bag of chips to eat, no video games to spend my Sunday on. I just had to sit with it. As you can imagine, I found this to be very unpleasant. But after a few days of just accepting the boredom, something changed. I found that I actually started to enjoy things that I had previously seen as too difficult or uninteresting. Here's an example. For a while leading up to the project, I'd wanted to learn the programming language Python. I was inspired by what it could do and even considered it as a career path. The problem was, I found it really boring. Practicing was a chore and I could usually never stand more than an hour of it at once. It's not surprising, really. I was going from the beautiful popping colors and icons of most social media to an empty coding terminal with no nice buttons to click and really helpful, easy to understand error messages like this. But during my experiment, I found that I actually started to enjoy it. By the 3rd week, I found myself enrolled in 2 Python courses. And it wasn't just coding. School, reading, playing sports, learning new skills. it all just became easier to enjoy. It was like my attention span was doubling with each day. All-around improvements I could hardly believe. Of course, none of this changed the fact that it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I truly miss being able to watch a movie or eat that pizza that's a little too big. But I struggle to think of a time in my life where I learned more than in those 3 months. So why was all this happening? Here's where shower thoughts come in. Inside your brain exists a bubble. And within this bubble are the things you think about, the things you do, what you enjoy, etc. Your brain craves to be stimulated. And when you give it that stimulation, it never has any reason to go beyond this bubble. And everything you think or do stays within it. Dopamine cheat codes are great at giving your brain the stimulation it wants. But take these away, and your brain is forced to venture into uncharted territory to get its stimulation. When I was no longer able to access my dopamine cheat codes, my bubble was forced to expand, leading to a flood of shower thoughts. My creativity was sparked, leading me to find new ways to stimulate my brain and enjoy them more. Our brains are sensitive to dopamine, but when you use dopamine cheat codes, you slowly desensitize it, meaning that after a few years, things you may have once found entertaining and enjoyable become boring and difficult, because your brain has been trained to expect such a high level of stimulation. Remember the scale? Quick and easy high dopamine hits can actually lower your basal levels of dopamine because your brain's tolerance goes up, meaning you're stacking the odds and the scale against yourself. The brain hates nothing more than when you take away something you've taught it to love. But experiencing boredom and having shower thoughts can offset this effect and might even increase your basal levels of dopamine. The best thing I ever did was nothing. During my experiment, lack of dopamine cheat codes led to boredom, which led to higher dopamine sensitivity and more shower thoughts, which led to different and more productive ways to stimulate my brain, which ultimately led to higher productivity, more motivation, and an increased ability to enjoy difficult things. The improvements that I saw in so many areas throughout those 92 days are still hard for me to believe. It honestly felt like I was cheating, like I was hacking my brain to enjoy hard things. So this had been life-changing for me. Hooray for me. But what's my Greenstone contribution to the world, beyond this talk? I took all my findings, researched, reviewed, drafted, and redrafted, and wrote a research paper. An academic piece of writing providing analysis, interpretation, and argument based on in-depth research. It goes over every change that I saw over the 92 days and gives context to them. I'm happy to say that my paper, Dopamine and Motivation, the Impact of Reducing Immediate Reward Stimuli on Motivation and Behavior, has been submitted to be published on Young Global Scientists Journal, Emerging Investigators, and the peer-reviewed Young Scientist Journal. It will also become available to the Green School community over the holidays through the Bridge newsletter. Everyone's dopamine cheat codes are different. I shared mine, which happen to be mostly digital. What are yours? Nicotine, alcohol, junk food, social media are common ones. But if you've ever seen that TLC show, My Strange Addiction, you know it could be anything from smelling household cleaning products to eating rocks. My project is by no means an attack on technology or digital devices. I actually spent just as much time on my computer during my experiment as I would normally. The only thing that changed was what I was using it for. So, I invite you all to become lab rats. Identify your own dopamine cheat codes and set down some boundaries. You might not want to eliminate them for 92 days, but try a week, a few days, one day, a few hours, and just see how you feel. Only we are responsible for our actions. If not us, then who? Now, in the spirit of my very science-based project, I feel that I have to acknowledge how I could have been wrong. My experiment was very much a qualitative research project rather than quantitative, meaning that the accuracy of my research depends heavily on the transparency of my journaling and reflections, rather than hard data and measurables. In other words, trust me, bro. There's also confirmation bias. I may have favored information that supported my hypothesis. And of course, there's the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people strangely feel more confident about a subject when they know less about it. If you asked me where I was in this graph, I would probably say somewhere around here, which is exactly how you know that I'm actually here. Finally, I want to thank Ibu Harriet, Puck George, my mom, Professor Drew, Puck Benjamin, Puck Dan, and everyone else who helped me on this journey. So with that, let's put away our dopamine cheat codes for a bit and have more showers. Because by the smell of this room, I think a lot of us need one. Thank you.